PCG allows for many different types of controls, including the ability to just change and override the material that you're using on the meshes that you're spawning. So if you have, for example, a certain kind of rock on the default static mesh, you can override that material. And there are a lot of different ways of setting this up, some more manual and some more procedural through PCG itself or through blueprints outside of the PCG graph that still will allow you to override the materials. I'm going to show you a few different ways of achieving this, but of course there are many others. This should just get you started on understanding how it all works and be able to get you going in changing and overriding your materials on your PCG graph as you need. To get started, we're going to go to Edit Plugins and make sure that PCG is enabled by searching PCG and turning on the Procedural Content Generation Framework, PCG. Make sure that is on and restart your engine as needed. And now we're going to do a very basic setup for this. I'm going to right click and grab ourselves a PCG graph. That's going to be our PCG basic setup. And we'll go ahead and open it up. Now in here, it's going to be very basic. I'm just going to right click and get ourselves a point grid by getting a create points grid node. In the detail panel, we'll change the coordinate space from global to local component. And then from here, I'm just going to do a transform points. And all I'm going to do on the transform points is just change the scale, min, and max to something like 0.9. So they're way a little bit smaller, so you can actually tell them apart. And then I'm going to use a static mesh spawner. I'm going to add a simple mesh entry to this. This is just our regular weighted option. And I have a simple rock here that I'm going to use for static mesh. Now already I can go ahead and take this PCG graph, drag it out into the world. And you can see here we have our little granite rock. Now because it's a little bit difficult to see exactly what's happening here, I'm going to give it a little bit of variation for this. Because the meshes are so small, instead of 0.9, which is what I did for the point information, I'm going to change the scale min to something like 2, scale max to something like 5, and have 360 degrees of random rotation. That should give us a good enough variation here. So now if I take a look here, we have kind of a pile of rocks. But again, what if we don't want this texture of rock? We want these rocks. This is fine for what we're doing. Got the variation of rocks, but now I want a different material. Well, there's a few different ways. The first way is manual. You can just override the material directly inside of PCG, and whenever those rocks spawn, they will use that material. To do that is very simple. In the static mesh spawner, under mesh entries, in your specific mesh descriptor, there's an override materials here. You can add a new index here for index 0, then just grab the material you want and just plug it in. And then you'll see that all of the rocks have been swapped out with the new material and you're pretty much good to go. Now this is a very manual process, and if you want to be able to control what material gets placed on here, it's not great. So there are better alternatives. What I'm going to do is duplicate our PCG basic setup, and I'll just rename it to basic setup underscore attributes. And I'll move our current one over to the left and drag our new one out. We'll go ahead and open it up and be able to control it from here. So now I want to add some controls. So with nothing selected in the detail panel, I can add a few parameters. I'll go ahead and add 2 of them. The first one I'm going to rename to static mesh, and the second one I will rename to material. Then in the static mesh, we just want to change the type here to be of a type static mesh object. And the material, we want to, of course, change it to a type of material, also object reference. I'll populate the static mesh by default so it has something to spawn, otherwise we'd have a little bit of trouble. But the material I will leave as blank for now. So now we can use this. I can right click and search for get static mesh, and right-click and get material. I'm going to take our static mesh spawner and move it over to the right. And then from the static mesh, I can drag out here, search for add attribute. And we want the parameter version, not the math operation. And make sure it is plugged into attributes and not the in. And you want to plug it in right after this transfer points and before the static mesh spawner, or honestly, you could do it beforehand as well. And then we want a second add attribute, and we want to plug the material into the second one, then plug it all the way through. Now for this first one, on the first add attribute, the output target in the detail panel, we want to just change the name of this. I'll just call this static mesh for convenience, and the add attribute on the material will also be called material. So now these attributes, static mesh with the static mesh we plugged in, and the material with the material we've plugged in, are now part of the point information for these, well, for these points. So now in the static mesh spawner, instead of the current by weighted option here for the mesh selector type, we want to change it to by attribute. And then in the attribute name for the by attribute, we want to specify the attribute we've created, which is the one right here, static mesh. So that's what we've typed in, static mesh. And what we'll see is we effectively have the original meshes Here they all are. They're spawning with the original material. Now we haven't overridden anything. We haven't done anything with the material yet, but we know that at least this graph so far is working. But now we want to overwrite the material. To do that, again, in the static mesh spawner, we'll have this by attribute material overrides. I want to check that on and add an input here. And it gives you an error. It says warning, mostly because none here is still not a thing. That's not an attribute that we have. But we do have an attribute called material. If I type in the attribute material and we take a look in the actual viewport, you'll see nothing has changed. But if I select it, select the PCG component in the detail panel, and under the instance parameter overrides, I have this material option. I can go ahead and override the materials. So if I search, for example, for basic materials, I can overwrite with basic acid 1. And for a moment, you'll see all of the rocks have been overridden with this basic instance 1. But you'll notice that this material instance, I cannot plug in here. It doesn't allow it to. Because it's not a material, it is a material instance. So in our PCG graph, we can go ahead and select this material, and we can change the material here from the type material to material instance, and of type material instance object reference. And then we can go ahead and overwrite it with the material instance. So while normal objects don't differentiate between materials and material instances, you can plug whatever one you want. When you're using these parameters, they are specific. So make sure you have material instance if you want material instance to be plugged in, or material if you want materials to be plugged in. But as you can see, we have now overridden the material. And if we want to choose another one, I can just plug a different one right in, and it automatically updates. And of course, with this method, I can also go ahead and just change the actual mesh to just a simple cube. And now we have a bunch of cubes with this material. Now, just so you're aware, I might be doing by attribute here, but if I go back to regular selector weighted, the option is still here by attribute material overrides. So don't feel like you have to use by attribute if you're using the material overrides here. But now what if you wanted to put different materials on all the rocks? What if you want to have a selection of materials and you want to kind of select between them? You don't want to override them all with the same material. Well, I'll go ahead and duplicate the PCG basic setup with attributes one more time. This one I'm going to rename to underscore material variations. And just like before, I'll go ahead and drag it out and just place it over here on the right. So with it open now, we can go ahead and take a look at our material. With nothing selected, our material is a simple regular input. It is a single object reference, but we can change it to an array. If I change it to an array, it's going to give it some complaints, but we can go ahead and add some inputs. Let's give it 3 different types of materials here. So here we go. I've plugged in 3 variations. So we have 3 very different ones. And if we take a look with nothing else changed, well, we now have variation of materials. Like, you might notice something, and it might be a little difficult right now, so I'm going to actually change the scale on these so you can really tell. I'm going to use a slightly different transform points here, and in this one, I'm not going to have it rotate. I'll just scale the rocks by 2x so you can really see. And here's the rocks, and you might notice something right away. It is in a perfect pattern. As you can see, it goes 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Now, depending on what you're doing, I bring this up because this might be very useful to you. Because if you want things to repeat in a certain way, perfect, you got it. It's done. This is exactly what you needed, right? But there is a way of getting it fully actually randomized. It's quite simple, actually. I'll duplicate this variations graph one more time, and I'll drag out the last one, which is kind of going to be a random one. To make it random, we need to attach this material not in an ordered fashion. For that, we have a simple node called match and set attributes. All we do is take the material, plug that into the match data. Instead of the add attribute, we use this match and set attributes. We just drag it all the way through, plug everything in. And now if we take a look, well, look at that. You can see based off of this kind of camo looking rock here, it is no longer repeating in perfect patterns. It is actually randomized now. And if I was to take this and just move it to the sides, you'll see the texture doesn't move. It doesn't update because, again, it is in perfect order. But for this one, if I go ahead and move it, you'll see it goes ahead and randomizes it because it actually is based on a seed. Now you might be wondering, well, how does it know that this is a material attribute? We didn't actually specify that. Well, the material itself here is an attribute called material, and we're already using material here as our attribute name. So it already knows it matches the material attribute with this and sets it to the existing points, and that's how we're able to get to it. This also has a seed of its own, so we can populate the seed if we want to, just randomize without moving. And there's other uses, of course, with this, with data assets and whatever else, but this is just a way of using a simple attribute and randomizing it through an array. And now if I really wanted to, I can go into the PCG graph, open up our materials, overwrite them, and if I want to, I can add another material and just grab another material, and now we have white rocks. Again, all randomized. And the final method I'm going to show you, and there are others as well, but the final one I'm going to show you is one where if you have a blueprint in the world and you need to just override the material on the PCG graph at any given time. For example, let's say you have a day version and a night version of a material, and when it swaps to night, instead of repopulating everything, you just want to, hey, this material, can we just swap it to the night version? Let's do that. So for that is quite simple. I'm going to right click, grab ourselves a blueprint class, type actor, and this is going to be our BP material override. I'll go ahead and open it up. Here it is, a blank actor, and we're going to need 2 variables only. I'm going to add 1 variable called PCG graph. The type is going to be just a simple actor. We're going to make it an object reference. And we're going to make it exposed by hitting the eye icon here. And we're going to add a material as the second variable of type material. And we'll make it also an object reference and exposed. Unlike in the PCG graph where you have to specify specifically material instance or material, here you don't have to. And now we just need a simple function. So we'll go ahead and add a new function. This is going to be our override material function. And then immediately in the detail panel, with it still selected, I'll go ahead and turn on call in editor. This will make it a button effectively we can click. So now in our graph, I'm going to take our PCG graph. I'm going to grab ourselves a get node. I'm going to right click and convert it to a validated get. So what this does is it makes sure that it is a valid input in that graph before it does anything. So that way, if you don't select something for the PCG graph, then don't do anything. There's no reason to do the rest of it. But we'll want to do the same thing with the material. So I'll drag the material out and I'm holding control as I release left click, and that gets me the get node. If I was holding alt while I release my left click, I would get a set node, just so you know. And I can right click and again convert to validated get. And plug in is valid from one into the other. As long as both things are valid, it'll do the stuff to the right. So now, from our PCG graph, I'm going to drag out and search for get components by class. Now, keep in mind, there is get component singular and get components plural. We want to get the plural one, get components by class. If you search for get component singular, you'll only get the first instance of it, which maybe you have only one instance, or you only want to get the first instance, in which case, just use that one. But we'll go ahead and use multiple. So if you have multiple types of rocks and everything, it'll grab them all. In the component class, I'm going to change it to an instance static mesh. So if you search instance, you'll get instance static mesh component right over here. Go ahead and select it, and we're good to go here. And now we can do a simple for each loop on these. If I search for each loop, plugin is valid here. So again, if both of these are valid, then we do this. Well, now we have access to the instance static mesh component. So from here, I can drag out, search for set material. From loop body, we'll plug this in. And the material, well, we can grab our material and drag it in here, or you can just drag it out right from here and plug it in. So a nice, very simple graph. Basically, just check that things are plugged in, and if they are, loop on them and set the material in index 0. Now, it might be a little bit hard to find this in the world, so I'm going to add a billboard here. Just a simple billboard in the components. And if I look in the viewport, you can see now we have a larger billboard. That'll be a little bit easier to spot than the little blueprint icon. I'm going to set the scale of this icon to be 10x of what it is. And there we go. With it dragged in the world, all I need to do in the detail panel is select the PCG graph and add a material. So if I go ahead and just sample from the scene, this graph right here, for example, I can then specify a new material. And honestly, I'll just go ahead and select a very basic orange material. And all I need to do is click override material. And just like that, all the rocks here have been turned orange. And you can do that with any of these. I can go ahead and sample the next one. And again, click override material, and all of these have been turned orange. Now, if I want to reset them, I can set up a function where I store the name of it, I can store the material it originally had, and then I can do some blueprint stuff to basically revert the material, because then I'll have a record of which object had which material. Or an easy way of doing it, of course, is just to do a simple regenerate. And as soon as I regenerate either one of these, you can see they come back as normal. And there you have it. Different ways of overriding material, all thanks to the power of PCG. So now you're able to do it manually with the power of PCG, and also if you want to, any way you want using a blueprint override as well. Now, as always, the project files for this will be available on my Patreon, where you can join these wonderful people here in supporting what I do. It really means a lot. And if you'd like to join the community, the link to which will be down in the description as always. And if you want to continue your learning PCG journey, check out this video right over here.